Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the last in this series of members curated talks about the history of domestic architecture in Sydney Living Museum's properties. Glad you're able to join us again. My name is Nellis, and I'm Director of Capital Programs with Sydney Living Museums. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which we're presenting today, in my case, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I also extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the lands from which you're all watching and listening. We've saved the grandest and most glamorous house until last. Today, curator Flyte will be delving into the design of Elizabeth Bay House, the Greek revival villa commissioned by Colonial Secretary Alexander Mcclay, and some of the quirks and twists of its history. From the late 1820s onwards, Sydney entered a period of significant prosperity and stability that resulted in a building boom lasting for about 10 years. Wealthy free settlers commissioned architects to design posh villas for them, and Governor Ralph Darling made land available east of the township of Sydney for a new development, of which Elizabeth Bay House is the largest and most ambitious. But it all came to an end with the financial crash of the 1840s, especially for Alexander Mcclay. But that's Mel's story to tell. Mel Flyte is an assistant curator in the House Museum's portfolio, mostly based at Elizabeth Bay House and Vaucluse House. Mel has a degree in Egyptology and also a master's degree in art history, but is a curator who relishes the opportunity to get hands-on with the treasures in our collection. And during the long COVID shutdown, when our properties weren't open to visitors, Mel could usually be found deeply engrossed in object conservation or hands-on curatorial cleaning. So now let's hear from Mel Flyte.
Thanks so much, Ian. And I'll just get started sharing my screen with everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Ian, and welcome everyone to this talk about the superb Elizabeth Bay House. It's built on Gadigal land and one of the house museums under the care of Sydney Living Museums. In fact, it's one of our original properties, which we began caring for in 1980 when the Historic Houses Trust was established. Today, I'll be discussing the architecture of Elizabeth Bay House, but the house is so inexorably linked to the personal history of the man for whom it was built. I'll also be delving into the story of Alexander Mcclay and his fall from grace. I'll begin by broadly discussing the villa as a type, I suppose, then look at the Greek revival more generally, and then focus on Elizabeth Bay House, probably the finest example of a Greek revival villa in Australia. James Ackerman's 1990 book on the villa provides a really succinct and helpful explanation of the villa type. It's a type of dwelling that has remained relatively unchanged in terms of concept since Roman times. That is, a villa is largely based on the idea of a comfortable home, a place for relaxation, pleasure, and enjoyment, away from urban life. A villa is fundamentally a reflection of a particular lifestyle and the invention of a particular social class, enabling them to have a place purely for enjoyment in a natural setting, but not supported financially by an associated estate or farm. Hence, a villa is a lifestyle only for the wealthier classes. A villa has no need to be functional other than to be a place of pleasure. So the style and design of the villa was mostly about displaying tastes and social attitudes of the day. Often it took the form of a revival of an older style that had come into fashion again as a rejection of the prevailing style. It stood as an idealization of country life, but was reliant on the economic resources of the city. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, there was a growing middle class for whom a villa became the ultimate display of taste and of their new wealth. One of the requirements of a villa was that it interacted with nature, either integrating with the surrounding environment or acting as a foil to its natural setting. It was set within a landscape, and its picturesque setting and external look was important, but it also needed to provide the inhabitants with an outward-looking view from within, with ease of access to the natural surroundings. Hence the frequent use of French doors opening off from the formal rooms, giving access directly into gardens and grounds. So what about the Greek revival? Well, revivals have always been a thing, but the speed at which they became fashionable, then fell from fashion, certainly increased during the late 18th and into the 19th century. Classical sources for architecture and design became fashionable in England during the 18th century as a reaction against the extravagance and frivolity of the Baroque. Neoclassical architecture in Britain was essentially taken from the examples of Palladian architecture in Italy, which in turn came from Roman designs. Coupled with this classicism and move away from the Baroque, the Georgian villa began to express the changes in the way society entertained and made use of their homes. Sir Robert Taylor was really a driving force behind the changing design of the Georgian villa, which became compact and functional dwellings with superb attention to detail, gone with the long corridors of interconnected enfilade rooms of the Baroque style. All the formal entertaining rooms were moved usually to the ground level to enable a connection with nature. Bedrooms became private spaces and moved to the upper floor, so the staircases were in constant use. But in these new compact villas, they tended to be placed at the centre of the house. They were often very showy, but without taking up too much space, so often elliptical and cantilevered and often top lit. We start to see the division of spaces also into masculine and feminine realms, but each echoing each other so they could accommodate the same number of guests. So often there will be a masculine dining room on one side and a more feminine drawing room for ladies to withdraw after a meal on the other, with a transition space like a hall or vestibule in between. You'll start to see a lot of these elements I'm describing will be found at Elizabeth Bay House. Taylor was one of the many architects making use of the teachings of Palladio and Roman classicism to inform their well-proportioned classical revival villas, but by the 1750s, Greece had grabbed the attention of British archaeologists, and the first publications of measured drawings of Greek temples from James Stewart and Nicholas Revet appeared. Classical Greek architecture of the 5th century BCE became a new source of inspiration for architects and designers, despite being quite a limited range of sources and without any surviving examples of domestic interiors. The first 10 to 15 years of the 19th century saw the Greek revival reach its zenith in Britain, especially in the villa designs of Decimus Burton in Regent's Park in London and in numerous country homes throughout Britain, appearing like Greek temples dotting the landscape. The proportions of these temples meant for the most part, these villas were two-storey, usually with a central entry portico on ground level. Alexander Mcclay was no doubt very familiar with this type of Greek revival villa from his time living in London and Surrey before he arrived in New South Wales in 1826. He was very much part of the growing middle class who were constructing country homes from the income earned in urban-based roles, such as the civil service. The other thing we need to remember about Mcclay was that he would have been well aware of the huge number of publications available by the early 19th century on villa designs. These were like pattern books for various types of villas and house, which included often floor plans and elevations. So let's now turn to the story of Alexander Mcclay and the construction of Elizabeth Bay House, which is considered one of the finest and most elegant colonial homes in Australia. Mcclay was an educated Scotsman, a product of the Enlightenment, who had joined the British Civil Service during the Napoleonic Wars and had worked his way up to the position of Secretary of the Transport Board. His private interests saw him appointed to the role of Secretary of the Linnean Society in London. Following the disbandment of the Transport Board in 1818, after the resolution of the war, Mcclay was unemployed with a house in London and an estate in Surrey to support. His hobby was also an expensive one. He collected insect specimens, purchasing celebrated collections of Lepidoptera at auction. By 1824, he had received his first financial loan from his eldest son, William Sharp Mcclay, but it would not be his last. At the age of 59, with little choice but to accept a well-paying role on the other side of the world, Alexander arrived in Sydney in 1826 with his wife and 6 unmarried daughters to take up the position of Colonial Secretary under Governor Ralph Darling. The position would make him the most senior civil servant in the colony. The move would also result in the relocation to the colony of Mcclay's celebrated collection. In fact, the largest collection of moths and butterflies owned by a single individual anywhere in the world. It seems that Darling and Mcclay quickly formed a strong working relationship. Both were politically conservative, and Darling respected Mcclay's work ethic. As a thanks, Darling apparently granted a significant portion of land on the eastern side of Woolloomooloo Hill to Mcclay. This would prove a controversial decision that elicited many public comments and suggestions of nepotism from Darling for his right-hand man. The land granted to Mcclay had previously been put to use by Governor Lachlan Macquarie in 1820 as part of his paternalistic attempts to civilise Indigenous peoples. A group of huts had been erected on the foreshore in an area called Gurajin and was given the name Elizabeth Town. Bungaree was leader of the clan who visited this site, but the township was not occupied and the site soon abandoned. The ridge known today as Potts Point and King's Cross consisted of quite rocky, sandy soil, so had not been put to use in the early colony except as the location for windmills. While one side of the ridge was granted to Mcclay in 1827, the other side, which faced the Sydney town, was subdivided into 13 land grants in 1828. And here you see 6 of those depicted on the map. These plots of roughly 8 to 10 acres were offered almost exclusively to senior civil servants. It seems that Governor Darling and his wife had visions of a constructed suburb that would be home to the elite officials of New South Wales facing across Farm Cove. There was even a suggestion that a new governor's residence would also be constructed here. Governor Darling wanted to create a high status area which would serve as both example and chastisement to the debased populace of Sydney town. This creation of a new community came with a set of conditions from the governor's office, the so-called villa conditions, which included the requirement to construct a freestanding villa of at least £1,000 value, set within a garden, and required the approval of plans by the governor or colonial secretary before commencing the build. So the language of the villa, a detached residence within a landscape setting, became the go-to architectural style of the colonial elite from the late 1820s. And there was one architect who became the go-to architect to produce these residences, John Furge. Surprisingly little is known about Furge's career before he arrives in New South Wales, but between 1829 and 1837, he produced some of the finest homes in New South Wales and worked for many of the main colonial families, such as the MacArthurs. He was born in Hampshire to a bricklayer father, but probably learnt his craft in London, where he established a successful career as a builder architect around Holborn, although no known examples of his work survive in England. It seems he made the decision to emigrate to New South Wales to start a career in agriculture, but returned to architecture and found great success. Furge's talents lay in his attention to detail and ability to produce homes of a quality not previously seen in New South Wales, making him the favourite choice for the colonial gentry. Surviving examples of his work include Camden Park House, Tempe House, Rockwell, Tusculum, and Aberglasslyn near Maitland. Demolished examples include Subiaco and Rosebank. His body of work is considered to be the high point in colonial Regency architecture. He brought to his designs touches of style, such as aedicule-style doorways carved in local red cedar with incised pilasters, architraves and pilasters on external doors and windows, and superbly crafted interior shutters, which fold neatly into recessed cavities. Furge was widely praised by heritage architects of the late 20th century. Clive Lucas claimed his work shows none of the provincial traits found in the work of his contemporaries. But where did Furge's skills come from? Certainly his designs far exceed what would be expected of a typical London architect with no known examples. Furge was clearly versed in the neoclassical language put to use by the likes of Decimus Burton and John Nash. Frustratingly, very little survives of his practice in New South Wales in terms of plans or drawings, only an office ledger really from 1834 to 1837, but in it are listed the names of many leading individuals in the colony. One of the first Furge villas was Godrich Lodge, built in 1831 for Thomas Mcclay, High Sheriff of New South Wales on Woolloomooloo Hill. Furge then spent the early years of the 1830s working on other Woolloomooloo villas like Rockwool and Tusculum. But what of Mcclay's house? As I mentioned, he was granted the 54 acres in 1827, but by 1831, there had been no start made on his house. The foundation stone would not be laid until 1835. The intervening years, Mcclay spent establishing his private botanic garden, a garden that would be renowned in Sydney and beyond. Mcclay's interests in the natural world extended beyond entomology, and his international network enabled him to import plant species from around the globe to plant in amongst the native flora on the site, a concept quite unique in New South Wales at the time. The garden was celebrated for its sophisticated landscaping and horticultural diversity, and several garden parties were hosted on the estate before the house was even built. Sadly, almost nothing remains of the garden that surrounded the house, apart from some remnants of the grotto and stone walkways hidden under apartment blocks. It is hard to imagine the scale of Mcclay's vision for this site. After years of establishing the gardens and grounds, the house would be the final cherry on top for Mcclay. Mcclay's ideas for the house seem to have been public knowledge in Sydney as well. Certainly there was an awareness that Mcclay had decided upon a Greek revival design as early as 1828. There is some debate about the origin of the design for this grand villa. It is likely Mcclay brought a design for a freestanding villa with him from England, perhaps a design from one of those pattern books or an architectural plan that were available at the time. But the task of successfully translating that design into built reality was given to Furge sometime in the early 1830s, and he did not fail. Arguably his finest house, and indeed one of the finest homes in the colony, construction began in 1835 and ceased in 1839. Despite the Greek revival coming to the end of its dominance in Britain at this time, to be superseded by the Gothic, Mcclay had decided upon the Greek revival for his home, with its respectable and scholarly origins, its harmonious symmetry, and understated refined detailing. Furge would make his most concerted effort to produce a Greek revival villa, and in comparison to Thomas Mitchell's Craig End, the first attempt at Greek detailing in a Sydney villa, with its clunky, heavy Doric colonnades stuck on the facade, Elizabeth Bay House is enormously successful as a marine villa with fine Greek revival detailing. However, the house did look quite stark when it was completed. Furge had planned to wrap a colonnaded veranda with Doric capitals around the house, with a second-story central triangular pediment above the entrance. These elements were not added, though it seems that this completed look was known to at least some people in Sydney. The artist Conrad Martins, for instance, who sketched and painted the house, included these details. It wasn't until renovations to the house in 1892, 1893 that a portico was finally added by George Allen Mansfield during the period of occupation by Lady Susan Mcclay. This portico, with its cast iron columns with stylized Ionic capitals, finally gave the exterior of the house a more completed feel. Internally, however, is where the house reveals the full extent of the fine Greek revival detailing, and the most spectacular feature, the elliptical stair and oval saloon. The loss of Furge's workbooks and designs mean that no full design drawings exist for the house. In fact, Furge, who retired from practice in 1837, would not have overseen the final stages of the build. It's possible James Hume was brought over by Mcclay to complete the house, or that John Bibb, Furge's partner, took over the final stages of the build. By 1839, the Mcclay family had taken up residence in the finest house in the colony. The house wouldn't have been out of place on an English gentleman's estate, yet its location on Sydney Harbour makes it a marine villa, and the use of Australian materials put to great use to create some of the signature features make it unique and Australian. Local sandstone was quarried on site to form the structure of the house. Mudstone from Marulan in the southern tablelands has been utilised not only for the central ground floor of the hall and saloon, but also polished and carved for use in the supporting corbels of the balconette and the fireplaces on the upper floor. And throughout the house, Australian red cedar makes up the architraves and skirting boards. In the formal rooms, the Greek Revival detailing is most on show. In each space, there are subtle differences in the cornices, ceiling roses, and fireplace detailing. There are two styles of architrave and pilaster on the formal floor, fluted pilasters in the saloon and entry hall, giving the effect of temple columns, and tapered pilasters with a Greek key or meander pattern incised into the entablature. This was a common feature in Greek architectural friezes of the 5th century BC, and it is put to use in the interior to add to those beautiful classical detailings. The main facade of the house faces east across the harbour, with a central entry hall and the drawing and dining room on either side. This entry hall establishes the rectilinear nature of the house, symmetrical and balanced. The entrance hall separates the two spaces and acts as a transition between them. The rooms have the same dimensions, but are very stylistically different. The masculine dining room has a black French slate fireplace, and the feminine drawing room, a white Carrara marble fireplace with anthemion and acanthus detailing, both apparently brought to Sydney by William Sharp Mcclay in 1839 from London, along with a suite of rosewood drawing room furniture. Both rooms have 3 French doors which open onto the sweeping lawn that existed in front of the house. Like many Georgian villas, the house has a secondary elevation with a bow front on the southern side where the breakfast room is located. This informal entertaining space echoes the oval of the saloon on a smaller scale and includes a lovely curved door feature. This space for informal meals and entertainment was furnished based on a Provenance Mcclay engraving in our collection and using a scrap of crimson and buff floral wallpaper discovered during renovations to recreate the interior. Also on the ground floor is Alexander's impressive library, which originally had a specimen preserving room attached and was apparently the largest room in any house in the colony in 1839. The room housed Alexander's specimens that he brought over, as well as his impressive library of over 4,000 volumes. Okay, and now for the showstopper. The ground floor rooms exist around this central oval saloon, which boasts an elliptical cantilevered staircase and the only oval dome in a domestic space in Australia, never repeated by Furge or any other architect. The saloon is entered from the hall through an oversized arch with a marble effect decoration. Top lit, this space still manages to impress and is an incredible feat of engineering, which brings drama and theatre to what otherwise might seem a rather sober interior. Elizabeth Bay House in its picturesque setting exists for us to imagine in 3 known depictions or portraits of the house commissioned by the family and painted by Conrad Martens. One of these paintings is in our collection. Conrad Martens trained as a landscape painter in England in the picturesque tradition. 2 of the main kind of aesthetic ideals of the picturesque are the beautiful and the sublime. He arrived in Sydney in 1835 and quickly gathered a group of leading colonists as his clientele, painting portraits of their homes set within his picturesque settings on Sydney's harbour foreshore. He became the leading painter of his day in New South Wales, merging the European picturesque tradition with a keen observance of the local flora, a skill he developed while acting as artist on board the 2nd expedition of the Beagle with Charles Darwin. In his views of Sydney and its villas, Martin places them further back in the landscape, situating them within a sublime setting, enabling him to capture the broad effects of nature rather than the details of daily life that were more typically captured in depictions of domestic architecture. Often his works are not peopled. There are no details like ploughed fields or fenced kitchen gardens. The beauty of the setting, the power of wild organic nature, the luminous atmospheric harbour all added to the effect and made the villa seem more desirable, more dramatic. Martin's works helped to reinforce the idea of the grandeur of this marine villa set amidst a natural environment, tamed slightly for pleasure, gleaming in the distance, surrounded by a darkened landscape. His three versions of Elizabeth Bay House also give us a sense of Mcclay's vision of the house. Martin's has depicted the house as though complete, with its encircling colonnade of Doric columns in the central portico with the triangular pediment above. Whether Martin's had seen the plans or spoke to Mcclay is unknown, but he had some awareness of the look of the completed house and merges beautifully the temple-like villa with a sublime landscape to full romantic effect. Whilst we can appreciate the vision of Alexander's grand plan through these depictions, it is the unfinished nature of the house which is so telling of the man for whom it was built. Mcclay simply didn't know when to put on the brakes, and the building of the house resulted in the rupturing of his family and the ignominious loss of his estate. William Sharp, his eldest son, had come to Sydney in 1839 to join the family in the colony after retiring from his career as a civil servant. Upon arrival in the colony with a suite of furniture for the drawing room and a range of marble fireplaces, he became quickly aware of his father's financial situation. Alexander's retirement in 1839, coupled with the Depression of 1842, meant bankruptcy was looming. It's possible it was William who put a halt on construction of the house. There are hints of the hasty completion in the physical evidence, the use of polished plaster in the drawing room, and no evidence of a chandelier being fitted. By 1845, the house would be William's, along with the extensive library and entomology collection. Alexander was in debt to the tune of tens of thousands of pounds. William agreed to take on the debts, but demanded the house and collection as well. Alexander's time at EBH was over. He was forced out to Brownlow Hill, residence of his second and probably now favourite son, George. The dream was over. So the 20th century history of the house is also a fascinating story of survival and changing use. Artist squat, function venue, apartment block. Not enough time to go into any of these today, but by the late 1970s, Mcclay's villa was ready to begin its next life as a museum. And today, under the custodianship of Sydney Living Museums, we continue to care for this fine house. And I'm very excited to say that from January 9 next year, you'll be able to come and visit again because we are reopening to the public. So thank you.
Thanks, Mel. What an amazing story. And how amazing that the house actually survived the 20th century at all. We're a little over time, but there's some interesting questions if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
One is about an interesting question about shutters, actually, that would those internal recess shutters first have been used by John Furge? Because the person asking has noticed that that type of shutter is also at Old Government House at Parramatta, whether they would have been original or added later on.
They weren't invented by Furge by any means, but he does include them in several of the homes. And they were kind of a typical feature of this type of home as well, because they enabled a sort of added level of security from the inside of the house, but also a way of managing the outside environment. So I think certainly in Australian homes, they would have been really useful, but they do appear in British homes long before Furge is using them. And it's just another one of those features that come over from British designs.
Oh, yeah. Mel, did all the furniture and contents that's in the house now originally belong to the Mcclays?
No, very sadly, very little of what was in the house originally survives. It's just simply been lost or scattered amongst various descendants. The house itself by sort of 1930 was empty. It sat empty as an artist's squat. And we're very lucky that we do have a couple of pieces that have come back to the house in the form of the original specimen cabinets brought over by Alexander Mcclay that are now on loan to us from the Mcclay Museum and are back in the library. But the furnishing of the house as a museum, sort of from the late 1970s and into the 80s, was a really difficult, long process. But it was based on a lot of different sources. So we have an inventory of the furniture from the time that Mcclays lived there. We have a deed of transfer from 1845, which informs a kind of description of some of the rooms, and that helps us furnish them. We also work from what was typical in homes of the time. So British and Australian furniture that would have been seen in homes like this, they tend to have a kind of Louis Revival style or an Empire style. So pieces that we can buy at auction, pieces that might be donated. We're using pattern books or manuals from the day that would have informed the types of furniture and curtain details and rug details and things like that. So it's a broad range of sources combined with the kind of physical evidence that we find in the house. So paint scrapes to enable us to match original colours, and details like, figuring out that no chandelier hung in the drawing room enables us to recreate the interiors with a lot of knowledge, to bring it back as close as we think as possible to what it would have been like. But we simply just can't be sure exactly because it just doesn't exist.
Yeah, but it's a very informed recreation of how they might have lived in the 1840s.
Yeah, and that certainly evolved as well. And initially, the interiors in the early 1980s were mostly put together by Leslie Walford. So they were very, very grand and very lush. And they were based on a description of a kind of yellow silk fabric in the drawing room. But as SLM sort of delved more into the story, we realized that we had to sort of almost strip back some of that opulence to tell a more authentic story of the house and the interior based on Mcclay's actual situation.
Yeah, fascinating. Look, we've run out of time again today, but I'd like to thank Mel Flyte for sharing her insights into the grandest house in the colony. For me, particularly those amazing landscape paintings that show the house almost like a gleaming white temple set in the landscape. This time next Thursday, be sure to tune into our next online talk when curators Anna Kostu and Dr. Jackie Newling will be taking you behind the scenes of our latest summer exhibition, How to Move a Zoo, and exploring tales from the archives. And we'll add a link in the chat for you to register. How to Move a Zoo has launched at the Museum of Sydney, and of course members enjoy free entry. So we invite you to find out more about the story of moving Sydney's zoo in 1916 from Moore Park to its current home in Taronga. We also have a great new members online talk series that we'll be launching in the new year called Animals in Our Houses. So join our curators in exploring the various animal themes in our houses and properties. These online talks will launch from Thursday, the 10th of February at 4 p.m. and we'll share the links in the chat as well. We look forward to seeing you then.